Okay. Ta-da! Yay! We're here, everybody. I'm going to try not to look at the camera. I'll try to look at all of you because that's the real important thing. Fuck digital. I hate it. Oh. Okay. So this is my attempt to talk quickly, briefly, about this project that I'm calling Rhizomatic Choir, and where I got the idea from, and how it actually is a real thing in real life that I didn't make up, but I'm trying to adapt it for our Western American issues, our real issues that we actually have. So, in real life right now, there are still immediate return hunter-gatherer tribes living in Africa the way that people lived 300,000 years ago. And they have a language system that I don't remember the name of. There's like a scientific word for it that they can trace to 54 to 108,000 years ago. And they know that because 54,000 years ago, some of these tribes split up, and now they're technically separate tribes with separate languages. So there's the Bayaka, there's the Baka, there's the Sand Pygmy Bush, like there's a few of them. There's not just one, not just two, there's like four something. And of course, they subdivide themselves differently, and I'm not here to sort of, get super into that, except for the fact that when they hear each other sing, they know they're related. Okay? Why is this important? Well, it's important because most people are practicing somatic exercises that are somewhere in the 5,000-year-old range, and written down maybe only like 2,000 years ago. So we're talking about the Jade Tablet, the Dodecahedron Tablet that talks about breathing, Qigong, which is like super old. And we're talking about the Bhairavi Tantra, which is like where almost all of our somatic exercises come from, which was written down in like 700 AD or something. But it's, of course, you have to add 2,000 or 3,000 years of oral lineage to that to be like, okay, so this is probably like 4,000 years old. And then we have pieces of ritual fragments, poetry, mythology rituals from like Sumeria, which are kind of like 10 to 12,000 years ago. The descent of Inanna into the underworld. So most of the time, most of us are sourcing at the very most about 10, 12,000 years of somatic ritual data. And we're kind of going, this is old. Like my ancestors did this 400 years ago. It's so ancient. Now, I talked to my ancestors, and they have talked to me, and I have a practice where I go further than I'm supposed to, because I don't really care what modern Western pagans tell me to do. I don't really care. I'm a mixed race person. I'm queer. The stuff just doesn't work for me a lot of times. So I ask questions, and I am stubborn, and I sort of go further. And a long time ago, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, I had a series of encounters with very, very, very old black people, women mostly, but there were some men, and they are my grandmothers. And I know that, and there's nobody can tell me jack shit about that. But the point is that they introduced me to something that they were doing that I was like, I don't really know what this is. It seems like a ritual, but it also seems like theater, and it also seems like improv, and it also seems like you're just all doctors, and you're all just like doing doctor improv all the time. And, yeah. So over the years, I just keep doing anthropological research, cultural anthropology, political anthropology, and I stumbled across a group called the Radical Anthropology Group, which actually goes to these hunter-gatherer tribes and actually stays with them for a long time, and they've written books about their actual lives, And one of the books is called Blood Relations. And it essentially maps out how language started, how ritual and symbology started. And it all started with 300,000 years ago when Homo sapiens first kind of arrived on the scene, and there were still four or five other great ape species that are now technically extinct, but we all interbred with them, so who the fuck knows what that means. It's like Denisovans and Neanderthals and all this other stuff. So those are all of our ancestors, and we have 300,000 years of them, and they're not just Homo sapiens, and then no one can really wrap their head around that in the first place. But I'm like, yeah, that's basic. Let's go further. So what ends up being true, or at least corroborates the visions that I had, was that, and this is where, trigger warning for all those people watching who are like, oh no, I can't deal with reality. In great ape communities and in human communities, because we are great apes, without learning to suppress our domination, our instincts are to dominate. Our instincts are to essentially steal, do infanticide, and rape. And that's not just like, oh, only the men rape. It's like, no. There's other things going on, and it's not so, well, the patriarchy. It's like, yeah, but not really. Like, we as a species are kind of crazy. Our instincts are to hurt when we feel pain, fear, or hunger. And especially our ancestors figured out that children play naturally until they hit puberty. And then they stop playing. And the reason they know this is because the moment that a young man starts to have sexual urges, they get into real fights, not fake play fights. This is bad news. This is like, oh crap, what are we going to do with our kids? This is us. And so all of our original grandmothers who survived figured out that they had to counter-dominate people into coming back into play after they hit puberty. And so this is the very first somatic correction. It's a learned behavior. We had to learn how to do this. It's not instinctual. But this is what makes us sort of like, oh, humans. And because they were able to do this, and they were able to do it in two ways. One is that they sang in this polyphonic, emergent, improvisational way to keep out big game predators. Because you got to understand, hundreds of thousands of years ago, tigers were much bigger, and there were like 7 or 8 species of giant saber-toothed things. And they hunted on the dark moon because they could see in the dark, and we couldn't. And so the only way to survive in forests, because they can smell blood and women menstruate and there's little children around the women, was to learn how to sing in such a way that they could pretend that they were more than they were. So the polyphony, which includes glottal sounds and yodel sounds and really interesting sounds, makes it so that animals think you're a lot more than you are. So that women and children could just be making this ruckus while they were in the forest and bleeding, and the animals would be like, I'm not, this too much, it's too much of a hassle. So that's number one. Number two is that women had to learn how to counter-dominate the male counterparts who were starting to be rapists and also philanderers and also infanticiders. And the way that they figured out how to do this is if when any one of them bled, they all painted their entire bodies red with ochre, and they became not human. This is the first theater. They made a symbolic speech action. This was pre-language, so this is like pre-grammar language. They created a speech action, which was a ritual, where they became red and changed their behavior on purpose in a flock, right? And because of that, it signaled to everyone else, wrong time, wrong species, and that women had the power to change themselves into animals or some kind of more than human thing. And that counter-domination that counter domination of like, this isn't sexy, I can't have my sexy time now, allowed our people way, way back, 300,000 years ago, to become safe enough for long enough. This is very important because safe enough for long enough allows us to develop brain size, and it allows us to develop grammar, which is a symbolic virtual ability that I can say these words, and I can say almost any word, and it just expends the exact same amount of energy. I can say fish, I can say tree, I can say cheese, and it's all the same calorie expenditure. Before this, we were more like gestural sign language apes, where if you really want to get something across, you have to expend your energy to really make someone believe you. Which is to say, if you're angry, no has to be like a lot. It can't just be like no, it has to be like, nah. And then someone goes, oh, that's no. Like toddlers, right? They're not like listening to your words, they're listening to you be like, ugh, and they're like, oh, you know? So these two rituals, these two symbolic actions, which are actually the beginning of theater, the beginning of art, the beginning of some symbol making, and the beginning of culture, and the beginning of grammar, these are all the beginning of all the things that we take for granted now. Okay. Any questions now at this point? Any interesting curiosities? Because there's more. There's more, obviously, but I want to get just the basics, you know? Yeah, new moon, full moon. New moon, full moon is extremely important. So new moon, full moon is how we came up with if you look at most mythological cultural scripts, they're binary. Which is to say there's an on and an off, there's a man and a woman, there's a powerful and a weak, there's a cold and a hot, there's polarity. And unfortunately, we've taken that way too far. But at the beginning, it stems from new moon, full moon. We could hunt on the full moon, and we were prey on the new moon. And women bled somewhere in there. And usually, and here's the other data, they've proven that in hunter-gatherer groups, when the body mass index and the nutrition are all like they were back then, which is to say not agrarian, but pastoral hunter-gatherer, eating yams and meat and, you know, whatever's in season, that women have menstrual synchrony. Now, today, people are like, it's a myth. Yeah, it's because everyone's doing their own thing. And they're not, like, in their matrifocal communities anymore. So what patriarchy did is it broke up matrifocal coalitions. It broke up the original union. This is the original union of economic solidarity and power. So, yeah, it's political, too. It's very political. It's not just magical woo-woo kundalini stuff. It's like, this is about our economic material conditions, and why we're so fucked is because we broke up the union, which was a matrifocal, where women didn't leave their homes when they got married. They just stayed, and the children were born there, and like the husbands just kind of came and visited. That's how it used to be, and it works to this day in these hunter-gatherer tribes because they're not able to be dominated by each other. They have counter-domination strategies because they still have to deal with this every single generation. They have to deal with people who want to hoard meat, who don't want to share their catch, their food, who want to have sex that's non-consensual. They still have to deal with this stuff. It's not like, oh, they somehow cured it. There's no cure for us. There's no cure for us. There's just learning a better way of being. Our instincts are still wildly nonsensical. Because our ancestors are not just human. They're like crocodiles and like chimpanzees, and they're not nice to each other. They're mean people. They're mean creatures. But they're doing it because they don't have the capacity to do what we can do, which is virtually imagine a new world together through language, which is symbolic. Other creatures can learn pieces of language, but they don't have the architecture. They don't have this ability to have it's called a digitation in the vocal larynx. It's the same digitation that allows us to be so good with our hands and thumbs, is the exact same thing that allows my tongue and my larynx to do all of this. So this is why people, when they say learn how to sing, they're always doing stuff with their hands. This is it. It's the same thing. Your brain or your neural web is connecting your hands and your throat and your mouth all the same. So you learn quicker when you use your hands or when you talk with your hands. It's just basic. So the thing with matrifocal coalitions is that we need to promote this in our culture now. This is not what Rhizomatic Choir is about. But if I don't talk about it, I'm really being very disrespectful. Because the main thing is if we don't have matrifocal coalitions and we don't turn the economic power back towards matrifocality, we're just dead. We're just dead. We're just because men don't know how to share, essentially. That's it. I mean, I was born in this body, and I'm like, yeah, no, it's terrible. And it's not like, oh, men are bad. It's more like, no, there's something else going on that we need to deal with. And our ancestors figured out how to deal with it. And then 12,000 years ago, when we started doing agrarianism everywhere, men took the power away from women. And this is actually shown in the mythology. They're not even hiding this. When you go ask these hunter-gatherer tribes that have become patriarchal, tell me your old stories, their old stories are like, yeah, so women cast spells on us and we had to like fight back and kill them, and like now we have the power. That's how they rewrote history. They were like, this is what we did. So, but we have to understand that from 300,000 to 12,000 or 10,000 years ago, we were all living perfectly well in matrifocal societies. But we weren't being able to hoard. Matrifocal egalitarian societies, no one can be a king or a chief. If you start to become too powerful, they kick you out of the tribe because you're being an asshole. And they do this too. If you're a really great hunter and you hunt too much, they tell you to stop, and if you don't, they kick you out. They don't care if they're losing your magical skill of hunting. They're like, no, other people need to hunt too. This is like, we don't think about, this is like mind-blowing stuff, right? So there's this part of it, which is like matrifocal unions, coalitions. We need to understand that our species survival is dependent on this. That's it, bottom line. There's no real arguing about it. I'm done with that. But the thing about the other thing is, when do men get to collaborate in the egalitarian game that we're playing? And it's with this other thing, which is emergent, improvised, polyphonic vocalization. To the point where these people do it for fun, because there's not that many big game animals anymore, so it's not like they really have to protect themselves from tigers and lions. They still do, but not like to the extent that they used to, because they've been hunted to extinction, right? But they still go on these 12-hour trance chant marathons with each other where they get super ecstatically bonkers high. But their high is not like cathartic. Their high is like they have more social bonding and they're more relaxed and they need less food, right? So you need to consume less, you're happier, you're more collaborative, and you're more chill. Okay, right? It's pretty good. So what this proves to me is that, like, it's not that we need psychedelic entheogens to have psychedelic experiences, is that we developed the capacity to have psychedelic experiences and then found plants that opened it up further. Because these people don't take any drugs and they get super high like they're on ecstasy, but not like the way we're on ecstasy. Not like ecstasy and Red Bull. More like chilling out, like just part of nature, like is this widening of their psyche. They're just like so relaxed and so happy, and none of them are dominating each other because they've practiced for many hours. And, you got to understand, children are in the womb when they're practicing. So that completely, the whole entire cycle every age is available. Like nobody is left out. I mean, you can leave if you don't want to sing, but that's fine. But what I'm saying is there's no like barrier to entry here. There's like every age, every person can join in this singing party, and they have some rules. And some of the rules are if you stop a song, which you can, they have like a stopping chant, like, and they stop, and everyone stops. So anyone can stop a song, but anybody who stops a song is required to start a new one. So it's like, whoa, that's pretty interesting, right? The other thing they have is that it's a deep listening process. So the collaboration is happening as almost if there's 1,000 songs happening at the same time. So you can listen, you can be in little clusters, but also you're all responsible for the entire composition together. So there's no conductor. There's just everyone listening to the feeling of the entire thing and making decisions together constantly to make it better. So imagine how much practice you'd have as a child just trying things out and seeing how it works. Oh, what if I do this song over here? What if I do this? And everyone doing that all the time for decades and decades and decades and decades. So that by the time you're like 30 or 40, your ability to improvise in collaboration is just so high. You're a master. Because you're listening on all these levels, and nobody's going to tell you you're doing anything wrong, because it's your job to figure out if you're adding or taking away from the composition. Everyone else just has to keep doing what they're doing. And if your song is dissonant, you'll know, and then you'll do something else, and nobody will exile you. Do you see the amazingness? So this is the original theater, the original somatic improvisation exercise. This is it. It's 300,000 years old. And it's the thing that allows us to collaborate in a way that we only think certain very skilled people can do. But actually, this is the human factor. This is what we learn to do to make ourselves safe enough to be around together. And it's not about talking or explaining. It's literally making sounds, vowels and consonants. There's no words, but there's like, in these hunter-gatherer tribes, they now have patterns that they've developed. But before they developed patterns, this is the key for us in Western situation. We don't need to jump to, I want to do this pattern. We need to stay in what patterns are emerging naturally without my conscious fuckery. You get it? So we can hear the terror and the joy from finding it out together over and over and losing it and finding it and losing it and finding it, which everybody who's an improviser knows. You lose the groove and you find the groove, and you lose it and you find it. But to do it without any instrumentation and without we're not using our words to buoy us. We're not going, oh, well, I know this pattern already, so I just want to sing it. No. We're saying, like, what does your body actually want to do right now? And how does that work with what everyone else is doing? It makes sense? You know, I'm trying to be very clear about something that's really, it's like a giant neural web, and I'm explaining it, and I recognize until you do it, it doesn't matter. My explanation is really just to get people kind of confused, so that they go, oh, really? I think this is stupid, or I think this is great. And I go, yeah, but that's not the point. The point is that we're going to do it now for a little while. So I'm open for questions, and then I have some points to make before we go into some rounds of practice. And of course, it's all very kind of loose. But I want, y'all are the de facto, the audience. So if you have any curiosities or anything, then people can see it on the video later. No questions? Okay.
I think I'm curious what you hope people in the future will get by witnessing us play.
I mean, it's hard to say. I don't know other than I have to do it because I have to see the experiment through to its mutation. I don't know what it'll mutate into. But I do know that I think we lost something along the way. We lost something that was all of ours, that nobody owned, that couldn't be copywritten, that couldn't be trademarked, that couldn't be branded. And now we live in a world where people think that they aren't artists and they're not creative and they have to go to college, and it's just a mess. It's a total mess. And I think kids know how to do this naturally. They're constantly bopping around, they're banging on pots and pans, they're doing body percussion, they're playing with their voice. But then at a certain point, they don't see any adult doing it. So they stop doing it. So we need to like rebuild our cultural baseline, which is the ability to do this kind of like complete nonsense that isn't nonsense. It has real import. It has real results and effect. It just seems like gibberish to somebody who's like afraid of not making sense or something because we've turned our rational minds to the king of everything, right? Everything has to make sense or else it's a waste of time. It's like, well, no. The only way we get to that is because our grandmothers figured out the best waste of time, which was not a waste of time. That's the only way we have any of this nonsense that we're dealing with, is because we were able to create safe enough long enough so that our brain could develop, and then we could develop symbolic thought and grammar, and suddenly we have a double-edged sword. Because the mind that can imagine heaven is the mind that also can imagine hell. And this is both the beautiful thing and the terrible thing. Because before this, we didn't have it. We didn't have this mythology polarity nonsense. But then it developed in co-regulation with the seasons and the moon. But now we're kind of too far in it in a certain way, and we can't get out. But the hunter-gatherer tribes, they get out all the time because they just play all the time. They're surviving and playing and playing and surviving. And they don't really have a need to conquer each other. And everyone who wants to conquer, they just kick them out. And that's part of the issue we're dealing with, right? I don't think we can be like them because, hey, I'm not in the womb, and I can't go back and be like, well, if I was in the womb, blah, 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 blah. No. But what we can do is really, because we all have practices and we know the value of practice, whether that's a non-dual practice or an art practice or a theater practice or whatever, is that we know the value of training something that seems at the outset to be illogical and kind of not working. And yet we work on it and suddenly something happens and we go, this is great. So we're just taking what happened to us, which was it all got shunted into theater and art in this weird way, like put in a box. And I'm just taking it out of the box again and going, this is the beginning of ritual, the beginning of theater, the real play that we can all engage in. And then people can do whatever they want with it, right? They can go and do whatever. But there's no zero. We've lost the zero. We've lost the base. Because the minute you start doing this, people go, oh, this is chaotic. It's not anything. But to the listener, there's no chaos. If you're actually in it, it's not chaotic. This is important. And this is the thing I think we really have to learn again, is that these things that we feel dissonance and start to get very afraid, if you're in a deep listening process, like people who listen to like noise rock or heavy metal or ambient music, they're deeply listening to relationships that are not about like, is this beautiful? They're like, oh, is this interesting? What's going on here? So this kind of perceptual quality is what I'm hoping people are going to reset themselves with. And after they get that, it's like their heart can open in this new way, and it's not merely like, oh, love, it's like a real intimacy. It's like intimacy with the sound that the wind is making through these leaves over here, and I can participate in that. I'm not separate from it. I'm part of this musicality that's happening all over, this vibratory musicality. Maybe. if we do it. I don't know. The project is like, can we as an in-person group over the course of the next few years have our own realizations about it and share those publicly with each other and with the larger community? Because that's the only way I think it really works. Kind of like a mutual aid network of like experiential practice, you know? Any other questions? Well, I'll say a few notes and then we can take a break and actually do the practices. But I just want to sort of lay out a rubric for people and for posterity here, which is that number one, it should be a gratitude practice for your oldest grandmothers. And I'm talking about like 300,000 years ago, no doubt. Like, you can wrap in everybody else who thinks that they're separate from these old black ape women, but I'm talking about the old black ape women. It's not an insult, it's the real deal. Ask them to help you. Say thank you for fucking like trying these things out and like surviving, because they didn't have to survive. They could have just let it destroy itself, which is what would have happened. And we would have still been like chimpanzees and gorillas now, who can only get past a certain point of artistic merit. They can't get past a certain level because they're too interested in domination and food and sex. And if you're too interested in that, you can't really make art. So, you know, we have them for everything that we like about life is their fault. You know, everything we like. You know, every aesthetic choice that we make is their fault, which is beautiful. It's like they made it possible for us to have these aesthetic opinions that we fight about. You know. So in one, it should be like a gratitude practice. Secondly, it should be more like a key recalibration, like a chi recalibration process, which is more like saying the parts of you that are not circulating well get a chance to circulate better. And that doesn't mean they have to change, but it's like letting air in the room. It's letting breath and sound into the places that haven't thought that they could have that in 10,000 years or something. So it's a kind of self-doctoring, it's kind of a group doctoring, kind of pre-doctoring field. You know, like the meditation before you go to acupuncture or something. You know. The first round that we will do is a self round, where we're really listening to ourselves, and it can be very insular and very quiet, but we're still listening, but it's much more of like a self-care, self-hygiene. So we're all like blobbing around in little pods over, you know. And we do that and we feel, and then we take a break. And then the next round is when we actually can open up our senses and actually kind of collaborate together. And it could still be extremely quiet. It is not about catharsis. It's not about like melody or anything. It's just about playing in this weird field of emergent sound making and percussion. And, you know, you can like knock on things, and you can you can bang two rocks together if you don't want to use your voice. Or you could just breathe and have the sound of breathing be what you're adding to the room. But that second round is where we're really trying to sort of emulate this flocking, emergent flocking quality of sound, where we can move around and we can like change position and we can like hide under the table. You know, like it's like it can be a little more like what kids do and like the weird theater stuff that we all like. But the first round, more like self-hygiene, breathing, toning for yourself, you know, humming, yawning, like getting yourself into a attuned place where you're not like dissociating and you really can tend to yourself. And then the next round being more of like a play. And then in between we'll do a little reflection, and at the end we'll do reflection, and we'll just like have some time to talk, hopefully. And that's sort of like the most basic thing. And we're kind of listening feeling, like we're listening feeling all the time. It's like a listening feeling exercise. So Pauline Olivero stuff will help out a lot of people, but it's more like this kinesthetic, vibratory, auditory sensing in which we listen to our impulses. But then also we practice a kind of restraint where we're not like trying to be the soloist, but we are trying to be like, oh, but I am being called to do this right now, and I'm just going to do it. And then it ebbs and flows, right? So I would say if there's any prompt, it's the listening prompt, the listening feeling prompt, and a kind of restraint, or I would say like an ecstatic restraint. So it's not like so morbid. It's like a fun, you like having fun being restrained. You're seeing what little you can do to actually like move the chi, and if you do need to be louder or bigger, then do it faster, whatever. That's totally fine. But what I'm saying is that like because we're Westerners, we have a bias towards this kind of upper, faster, higher, more thing. And I think just to curb it, that we could make beautiful music together being extremely subtle, and we could all know that. We could all feel that happen. Okay, I think that's pretty good. I think it's pretty good. I'm going to stop recording.